folks, it's me Rena from Snarks Crochet, and today I am making the Sophie scarf. First off, totally random, I totally got a new camera recently because I have been very tired of my video quality being kind of bad while using my phone, because whenever I would use my phone to film, I would use the front-facing camera of my phone, but the thing is, the front-facing camera is the lower quality camera, but if I use, the higher quality camera, I can't see what I'm filming. So I ended up getting myself a new camera where I can actually see myself and see like what is actually being filmed. I'm still gonna need to get used to everything, but yeah, hopefully you'll be seeing an increase in quality of my videos. That aside, everyone in the crochet knit community knows about the Sophie scarf, right? It's the petite knit Sophie scarf. You know what I'm talking about. It's that small, short, kind of chic scarf that is also controversial. Some people say this should be free. Some people also say it's kind of bland, but others will say, girl, get your bag. If you want to see anyone do a deep dive on it, you can watch literally the 10 other videos of people talking about the discourse around the Sophie scarf, or even just go to the Craft Snark Reddit and you can see all sorts of discussions about that. That's beside the point. I want to try knitting it this time because you know what? I've fallen down the trap. I've fallen into knitting. I want to try knitting, okay? And I think it would be really cool if I made the Sophie scarf. Now, I am a beginner knitter. I can barely knit. I can barely even read a knitting pattern. I was kind of influenced because I watched Passionate Kelsey make the Sophie hood around Christmas time, and then I saw Sakura from Le Seraphim knitting the Sophie hood too, and she wore it in the cutest bow ever. And so the Sophie hood, I think, kind of blew up, and I think that one is a lot more popular than the Sophie scarf. But I figured I wanted something a little bit lower maintenance, lower commitment, if that makes sense. So that's why I want to try making the Sophie scarf. So I did end up buying the pattern, and we're going to see how this works. The yarn that I'm going to use for the Sophie scarf is actually this ball of scrap yarn. This is the leftover of a 1 pound skein of Crafter's Secret Big Idea from Hobby Lobby. I originally used this yarn as part of Granny Square Christmas sweaters that I made for me and my fiance about 2 years ago, and I still have a decent amount of it left. So I'm going to use this for my Sophie scarf because I kind of want the Sophie scarf in red. I don't know, Now, in terms of how the Sophie scarf is constructed and how that works, my understanding is that it's essentially like a garter stitch scarf that's knit flat with I-cord edging around the sides. For me, I think the hardest part of all of that is going to be the I-cord edging because I can barely knit. I have a pair of 5mm knitting needles, circular knitting needles. I bought these for hats, which is a US size 8. That system still confuses the ever-living hell out of me, but you know what? I'm just here, whatever. Let me look up my pattern that I have pulled up here and see how this goes. So I'm probably going to go for the small. It has a gauge swatch, but I am not using the yarn she's using, so maybe this is my take, but if I'm not using the yarn she's using, does it really matter what my gauge is? I don't really feel like doing math either, and I don't necessarily think it matters at the end of the day because it's a scarf. Cast on 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 stitches. Now work increases every 8th row along one side of scarf. Oh boy, okay, hold on. Knit to last 3 stitches. Slip the last 3 stitches purlwise, so with yarn in front. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So now I have row 8. Okay, this is what it looks like before I do the increase. I think I'm doing this right, but I'm also not sure because I'm a little dumb and I can barely understand knitting patterns. But I think I'm getting this right? So I'm about to do row 8. I think row 8 is where I do the increases. So knit 2, knit front and back. What does that mean? Okay, so knit front and back. Let's look up a video because I don't know what that means.
So as we've talked about before, this is the front loop and this is the back loop. So in order to work a KFB, you work a knit stitch into the front loop, which is normal, but then you also work a knit stitch into the back loop of that same stitch. If that sounds too complicated, please stay with me. I believe that you can totally do this. So we start out by going into the first stitch and knitting it normally. So go into the front loop, bring the yarn around front to back and pull through a loop, okay? But do not slide that stitch off your left-hand needle yet. So if we bring our right-hand needle around behind the other one, you can see that there's a front loop here and a back loop here. We're gonna go into that back loop. So we just bring our right-hand needle and we go into that back loop.
Just did my increase. So work rows 1 through 8 a total of 22 or 27 times. Now until there are about 28 stitches on the needles. You know, because I'm using bigger yarn, I have a feeling that I probably will not be increasing by that much if I want the same effect of that scarf. But at the same time, I also don't know if I just follow it for the sake of following it, like exactly to make my life easier. But that also means I'm gonna have to figure out how to count my rows because I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can. This requires a lot of counting. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do that. Maybe I should do like the stitch marker method where I just have like 5 million stitch markers or something, but I don't know. My understanding of like some people's complaints about the scarf is not necessarily the fact that it's like easy and simple. It's the fact that people were like, oh, this is a good beginner project. But I have a feeling that this is going to require a lot of concentration to do. So wish me luck on that. Because I might need that. I started using a bunch of these circle spiral stitch markers to kind of help count my rows because I don't know how to count at all. But this is how it's going. It's fine. I don't know how else to say it. It's fine. I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of an unhinged amount of stitch markers. Because maybe it'll be more useful once I start increasing more. That way it'll be a little bit more obvious. Maybe on the increase row I use a different stitch marker so that way that'll mark my edge, I guess. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is 7 right here, and then for row 8, since you increase every 8th row, I'm gonna add this at the end, and this will kind of help me differentiate whether if that's an increase row. I think if I do it this way, it'll help me kind of keep track of everything since I can't count. Okay, I got another round of increases. And we just keep going at it until the end of time. Okay, so I have to do my next set of increases, but look at how good this looks. I'm kind of proud of like my ability to figure this out because I think I've tried to do this before and have always failed. So a lot of people criticize Petite Knit for like selling and charging money for what's essentially a very simple pattern. And I can see why on that end. However, her instructions are very clear. Whereas if you were to look up this scarf or like a free version of this pattern, the instructions are not nearly as clear. Maybe to more experienced knitters, it's very clear. It's like, oh yeah, whatever. This dupe is basically the same thing. But for me, I tried looking at free versions of it and I couldn't figure it out. Maybe I'm just dumb, but for me, it's actually very simple to look at and understand. Also, a lot of people say it's kind of expensive, and I guess like it's expensive compared to free. When I did buy the pattern, the conversion's about $5 US. So I feel like that's fairly standard for like any written pattern, honestly, especially in the knit and crochet world. There are some patterns I've seen that are like $12. I find those to be kind of excessive. Though those $12 patterns do tend to have like very detailed step-by-step instructions. And so maybe I would understand a criticism of Petite Knit if she had sold these for like $12 for this really simple pattern, but I think people just like to hate on her. Get your bag, you know? Like, my hot take, if anything, is that people don't necessarily have an issue with what she's doing. They just have an issue of why her designs are so popular. And her designs are so popular because they encompass the bland beige aesthetic. I think that's the reason why a lot of fiber artists seem to dislike her. I don't even think it's because she's profiting off of like very basic patterns. I think it's just like the fact that her marketing of her patterns is like very much bland beige aesthetic, and I can see a lot of people being kind of upset with that because it just means everything is boring. I feel like the popularity of Petite Knit is just like the representation of people being basic and boring. Not necessarily the fact that she charges for basic patterns. It's more so what she represents rather than like what she does actually. In my opinion. I feel like that's the actual underlying criticism of Petite Knit that people don't know how to say. It's not whether she's charging for basic patterns. Let's be real here, there are tons of people who charge for basic patterns for way more than Petite Knit, to be honest. And I would say the original Sophie scarf pattern is incredibly clear. Some may criticize her for like saying you can't sell anything you make with my pattern. That's a little bit criticizable, maybe. But even then, it's kind of like, whatever. Not everyone's making things to sell stuff. I don't know. I do genuinely think it's not necessarily her as a designer that's the problem. I genuinely think people are just more upset with what she represents and like the overarching social picture that she represents rather than like her herself as a knitwear designer. That's my hot take, I guess. Her patterns are fine. Are there free ones? Sure, but you can just knit those free ones than hers. That's kind of all I had to say. Okay, so little update on the Sophie scarf. I have about this much done so far. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 increases, about to start the 11th one, so I'd say I'm about halfway through the scarf, probably because I'm using worsted weight yarn. It's a lot bigger than I expected it to be. I also figured out a way to count my rows without having to use like 8 stitch markers at a time. Basically, I have 4 stitch markers. Each of these 4 stitch markers represents the odd row, and then basically when I go to my increase row, which is the 8th row, I will then put like one of these clippy stitch markers on there. And yeah, that's how I have been increasing and keeping track. And then that way, when I count the increases, I just count the stitch markers. So technically this is my second increase, because my first increase was like down here. But in the instructions, it says like, okay, after row 8, repeat rows 1 through 8 22 more times. So I basically just increase until I get about 22 of these stitch markers, which also means I need to grab like way more stitch markers, but it is what it is. There was one part where I kind of messed up on the I cord right here, but you know, if you look at it from afar, you're not going to be able to tell. I feel like I can tell because I notice all the faults in my own work, but that is what it is. Because of my stitch marker system, this is a lot easier than I expected it to be. Again, I have tried to make this before, and I failed multiple times. I think the hardest part, in my opinion, is the I cord edging. That is definitely the hard part, and so starting this, the I cord edging feels borderline impossible. But now that I'm further into the project, it's a lot easier to do the I cord edging because there's more stitches to do. So yeah, that's kind of it. I've just been working on this. I guess I'll check back in when it's time to decrease then, because the increases are very easy. It's definitely a different way of increasing than what I have seen, but then again, I haven't done much knitting in the first place. Most of the things I have knit have been knits in the round where I decrease, I don't increase, if that makes sense. So I haven't done too much knitting with increasing. So this increase is actually easy enough. It's a little tight. I still don't know what my, I guess, knitting tricks would be. Another thing is that I'm a little afraid that this might get too wide for like the aesthetic of the scarf, because this is pretty wide in itself for the sake of the skinny scarf, right? And also I think she used much thinner yarn in the original gauge, and I'm obviously not following that. Maybe this might be wider than I expect. I do want to follow this as written because I don't know enough to like kind of make up my own thing for knitting, but yeah, that's kind of it. So I'll check in later. Okay, I'm like this far today. I think I'm gonna check out for the day because I think my hands are starting to feel it a little bit. I feel like this pattern is something you could power through if you were faster at knitting, but I'm not in that power through mode right now. Though I did get quite a bit done on day 1 of knitting a Sophie scarf, so I'll take that, right? Well, this is technically isn't day 1, but it's like essentially like a proper day of me knitting the Sophie scarf, right? You know what I mean. Also, I actually had a much bigger ball of yarn than this before. I'm not worried about necessarily running out of this specific yarn already, but I'd like to not have to tie on another skein if I could help it. I think I'm just genuinely shocked it used so much yarn. Either I didn't have much yarn to begin with, or this used a surprising amount of yarn than I expected. Because I'm so used to knitting just not using any yarn, so I don't know. So I'm starting to get a little skeptical about the size of my Sophie scarf because I'm about over half the amount of increases I need to do, but I'm worried that it's going to be too big for the effect. So let me measure this real quick. According to the pattern, if I'm making the small size, it's 4¼ inches wide, or 5 inches for the large one. And then it's supposed to be either 31½ inches long, or 40¼ inches long if you make the large one. So I have a tape measure. Let's see how wide this is. It's about 5 inches and about 17 inches long right here. So I think what I want to do, I could either make one more increase, or this row will be the start of my decreases. With that in mind, I think to get the effect and dimensions of the Sophie scarf, I think I'll do my decreases right here. If I wanted a larger scarf, I probably should keep doing the pattern, but I think it might be better for me to actually start decreasing at this point, since I'm at the point where I could either increase or decrease, because the pattern is kind of the same. When I read this pattern, it's essentially the same thing, except, row 8 is you knit 3, okay, SKP, which stands for slip 1 stitch knitwise, knit 1, pass the slip stitch over the knit stitch. Let me look up how to do that real quick.
Now you're going to take that slip stitch and pass it over that knit stitch and off the needle. So I like to hold on to that knit stitch with my right index finger.
Okay, so that was my first decreased row. And I'm not going to put a stitch marker here. But, so because I have 16 increases here, or 16 stitch markers here, because it said to repeat the first set of increases like X amount of times. In the instructions for the decreasing, you repeat that a total of like X minus like 1 amount of times. So like I have 16 here, so then I need to repeat this decrease 15 more times. So let me grab 15 more stitch markers for all of this, and then I will have the stitch markers kind of do my thing. I was hoping I'd have a lot more stitch markers, but this is kind of all I could find of these stitch markers. But I do have some of these like clip stitch markers that I got when I had my hooks and needles box that I kind of hated. But these aren't my favorite type of stitch markers, but at least they won't fall when I actually clip them on, so that's something. So I'm just gonna work on the decreases now, and I'll check back in soon. So I'm almost done with my Sophie scarf, and as you can see, I will say I still hate these stitch markers, but it's kind of what I had. I am 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I am basically one decrease away from essentially being towards the last part of finishing a Sophie scarf. I'm going to say this, I'm genuinely shocked by how quick this was overall to do. To be fair, I am using smaller yarn than what's originally recommended for this pattern, so it's kind of modified, so I didn't have to do nearly as many rows as the original pattern, but still, it's still very quick and simple. There's actually a take I saw about the Sophie scarf where someone said that the Sophie scarf is not a good beginner project. And that I agree with, but she said that it's not a good beginner project because it requires a lot of like concentration. And I would say yes, that is the case. But if you do the stitch marker method that I'm doing, it's not nearly as much concentrated needed as some people will say. I do agree with the take that it is not a beginner project because again, this is like maybe my third time attempting the Sophie scarf. I mean, to be fair, I was also kind of doing it like half-heartedly, so it's not like I was seriously trying, but like I casually tried to do the Sophie scarf before, and it wasn't clicking to me until now. But I also was trying with free versions of the pattern. So maybe the way it's written out, and I guess the OG Sophie scarf pattern, is probably what made it click to me. But I do think from a standard knitter's perspective, it's very simple. But for a beginner knitter like me, it's a lot more difficult to wrap my head around than I thought. I don't know. Bind off the first 3 stitches knitwise and bind off the last 3 stitches purlwise. Let me look up what that means because I have no idea.
using your right index finger to hold that second stitch in place.
Okay, so
putting it up over the top of the right
needle.
needle.
That looks really bad. Okay, that's the Sophie scarf. This bind off looks really bad, but now I can actually take all my stitch markers off because, oh my god, I have like so many on here. Okay, yay, Sophie scarf, this is done. Now, according to the pattern, this is supposed to be 30 to 40 inches long. I'd say it probably reaches that, but let's try it on. I'm wearing a hoodie right now, so let me get out of this. Okay, I am back in a nicer shirt. I changed into like a plain white button-up shirt because I feel like it would complement the Sophie scarf a little bit better. Now, if I put it on like the original photo, I'm not a fan of this look. Also, I feel like this is choking me. Let's not do that. But that is how I've seen the Sophie scarf, you know, styled before. Even if I modified this piece, I don't necessarily think that a scarf that short, styled like that, is going to fit me. I think petite knit is a lot thinner than I am, so I don't think that method of styling is going to work for me. But I do think styling it like this might give the same effect, and it might actually work for the dimension scarf I made. I did also consider another means of styling this, and let me see if I can find the accessory I'm looking for. Okay, I could not find the exact accessory I was looking for, but I found a hair tie, and it's basically the exact same concept where you just get a little hair tie, scrunch it together, and you have this really cute, like, almost sailor look. I don't know. Something about it feels very cute. And I will say that is another reason why the Sophie scarf is kind of controversial. Primarily because it looks cute, but a lot of people don't like the idea of a scarf being so short. I mean, for me, it's whatever, but I tend to kind of agree with that. But, you know, regardless, it still was a very easy project to knit up. Overall, I'd say I'm pretty satisfied with the pattern. I think the pattern is fairly simple to finish. The I-cord edging took some time for me to figure out, but I will say once I figured it out, I figured it out, which is great. You gotta love that, learning and stuff. Despite like the conversations around it, whether it being overhyped or not, I still think it's fine. I can agree with the sentiment that like we probably shouldn't be charging for basic patterns, but I don't necessarily associate that criticism with the Sophie scarf in particular. I kind of have that sentiment for like all basic patterns, you know, like not just petite knit. It was fun, it was nice and quick, and I'm still genuinely shocked by how quick it was to knit up and how fairly just easy it was for me as a beginner knitter. Okay, to be fair, this is try number 3, right? Like the first 2 attempts were done not in a video, but I have been wanting to make a Sophie scarf for a while. I also want to try making a Sophie hood, but that's probably less likely to happen than a scarf. But you know what? I low-key want to try making another one in a different yarn, but that might be a problem for not now, if that makes sense. I will be concluding my video here. Thank you for watching, and let me know down in the comments below, have you ever made a Sophie scarf? And what yarn did you use? And did you like making it? With that, I'll see you in the next one.